They put him under house arrest. They banned his books. They forced him to recant his discoveries. But they couldn't destroy what Galileo actually believed, because his faith in God was stronger than his fear of the Inquisition. Most people think he was persecuted because he believed in science over faith. But the real story is that Galileo was a devout Catholic who trusted God even when the Church condemned him. This is the Galileo history forgot. Galileo was born on February 15, 1564, in Pisa, Italy. His father was a musician, and his mother came from a wealthy family. From childhood, Galileo showed incredible brilliance. While studying at the University of Pisa, he watched a swinging chandelier and discovered the principles of pendulum motion. By the time he was 28, he was a professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, one of Europe's most prestigious institutions. He was ambitious, brilliant, and hungry to understand the universe. But Galileo was also a practicing Catholic. His faith was central to who he was. When he looked at creation, he saw God's handiwork. The key to understanding Galileo is his belief in what's called the two books doctrine. He believed God wrote two books. The first book is Scripture, God's revealed word. The second book is nature, God's creation, written in the language of mathematics. Both came from God. Both were true, and both deserved to be studied. Galileo famously wrote, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect intended us to forego their use." In his view, God gave you a mind to understand his creation. Using your reason to explore nature isn't disrespectful, it's honoring the way God designed you. This core belief shaped everything Galileo did. He wasn't rebelling against God. He was exploring God's world. Around 1609, Galileo heard about a new invention from Holland, the telescope. He quickly built his own improved versions and pointed them toward the heavens. What he saw was revolutionary. He discovered that Jupiter had 4 moons orbiting it. He saw that Saturn had rings. He observed that Venus showed phases, just like our moon, and he saw that the sun had spots on its surface. These observations strongly supported the heliocentric model, the idea that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the system. Galileo published his findings in a book called The Starry Messenger in 1610, and it became an instant sensation. At 46 years old, he was celebrated as a genius and invited to Florence to become the chief mathematician. In Galileo's mind, he was simply revealing God's incredible creation to the rest of humanity. Now, the Church wasn't necessarily opposed to science, but they were deeply concerned about how the Bible was being interpreted. If the Bible seemed to say that the earth was central, and Galileo was saying the sun was central, who was right? This created a tension. In 1616, the Church officially declared that heliocentrism was contrary to Scripture. Galileo was told not to teach it as fact, and he accepted this ruling. Years later, in 1632, Galileo published his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In it, he presented both the Earth-centered and Sun-centered models, but his arguments clearly favored heliocentrism. The Church felt deceived. They arrested him. In 1633, at the age of 69, Galileo was brought before the Roman Inquisition. The trial was harsh. They demanded that he recant his views or face prison. Under immense pressure, Galileo recanted. Legend has it that as he rose from his knees, he muttered, "And yet it moves," still privately believing in heliocentrism despite his forced denial. But here is the crucial point. Galileo never recanted his faith. He did not become an atheist. His belief in God survived the trial completely intact. He was sentenced to house arrest in a villa in Arcetri, near Florence, where he spent the last 9 years of his life. Aging and eventually going blind, he wrote, "I remain persuaded that the motion is true, and my condemnation is unjust. But let superiors will be obeyed." He submitted to the Church's authority while maintaining his scientific conviction. He trusted in God's plan even in the midst of suffering. His faith wasn't broken, it was refined. During his confinement, Galileo didn't curse God. He didn't abandon his faith. In his letters from this time, he often expressed his trust in divine providence. He once wrote that if the decisions had gone in his favor, they would have been the decisions of men. But since they went against him, he could be certain they were the decisions of God. Think about that for a moment. Galileo interpreted his persecution not as proof that God had abandoned him, but as part of God's mysterious plan. He trusted God even when facing profound injustice. During his house arrest, Galileo continued to study nature, remaining endlessly curious about God's creation. His faith wasn't shaken by his circumstances. It was deepened. The modern narrative often paints Galileo as a martyr for science, crushed by religion. But the real story is much more nuanced. First, many Catholic priests and officials actually supported Galileo. The Jesuit order, in particular, was very supportive of his astronomical work early on. Second, the conflict wasn't a simple case of science versus faith. It was a complex debate about biblical interpretation and the authority of the Church. Theologians at the time disagreed on how to read the Bible in light of these new discoveries. Third, Galileo himself believed that Scripture and science should harmonize. He famously said, "The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." He argued that the purpose of Scripture is spiritual salvation, not scientific instruction. We shouldn't expect the Bible to be a physics textbook. This is actually a very sophisticated theological position. Galileo wasn't he was trying to understand how both divine revelation and natural observation could be true. The conflict wasn't inevitable. It was a tragedy created by Rogoditi on both sides. So what does Galileo's story teach us today? First, it shows that science and faith don't have to be at war. Galileo was both a devout Catholic and a brilliant scientist. His faith motivated his curiosity, and his observations deepened his awe of God's creation. Second, true faith can sustain you even when institutions fail you. Galileo faced injustice from the highest religious authority of his day, but his personal faith in God was never destroyed. And third, the popular conflict narrative is often exaggerated. The real story is messier, sadder, and much more human than the myth we're often told. Galileo died on January 8, 1642. He was blind, aging, and under house arrest, but he was still studying God's creation. He was still trusting God. It wasn't until 1992 that the Church formally apologized for condemning him. But it seems Galileo had already found his peace with it long before. When Galileo looked through his telescope, he saw moons orbiting Jupiter, and he saw God's creation in all its mind-bending complexity. That vision never shook his faith, it strengthened it. He believed God gave him eyes to see and a mind to understand. He believed that both Scripture and nature revealed divine truth. Even when he was persecuted, he believed God's purpose would prevail. Galileo's life shows us that the greatest minds don't have to choose between science and God. They can embrace both. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more untold stories about scientists who trusted God. Thanks for watching.